Damn it. It's not starting. The shout ripped through the sweltering afternoon at Fort Hood, Texas. A Black Hawk sat motionless, refusing to ignite despite dozens of technicians crowding around. Computer screens glowed a sharp blue, every system flashing perfect, yet the engine remained lifeless. High-ranking officials waited, tension climbing with every passing second. In the middle of the circle of young men smirking under their breath stood a frail old man, his hair a crown of white. No one believed him, no one wanted him. Yet it was those very hands once again that would decide whether the Iron Bird would rise to life or remain dead forever. The Texas sun poured down on Fort Hood like a scorching blanket, spreading across the endless runway. The air seemed to freeze around the dull Black Hawk, its fuselage steeped in sun and dust, its rotor blades drooping like weary arms. 6 hours had passed since the first failed startup, and each passing minute only made the tension heavier. On the grandstand a few hundred meters away, officials in suits and uniforms still sat waiting. Every glance, every whisper carried across the hot winds like invisible needles stabbing into the pride of the young technical team. They were the generation of software, of glowing tablets, of data screens that always promised stable. They trusted the cold numbers more than the weary intuition of human hands. At the center of that circle stood Ethan Brooks, the chief technician, only 27 yet already accustomed to command. Tall, with a regulation haircut fit for a military advertisement, his voice was dry and confident. To Ethan, everything had a solution in the system. And if the system could not find it, then the problem surely did not exist. It was a belief bordering on religion. Beside him, Lieutenant Mark Sanders, a West Point graduate of less than a year, stood stiff with textbook posture. His uniform was sharply pressed, his eyes cold, jaw clenched. For Sanders, the presence of an old white-haired man on the runway was a stain on the military's solemnity. He spoke little, but his furrowed brow and folded arms said enough. To him, this was nothing but a clumsy sideshow. And then they saw him, Jack Callahan, a thin figure, walking slowly, his faded flight jacket dating back to before most of the team had even been born. Jack lingered at the edge, hands in his pockets, pale blue eyes fixed on the Black Hawk as if he were studying a living creature, not a dead hulk of metal. At 72, he carried the silence of a man who had witnessed too much loss too many times when metal melted in firestorms and men were crushed between the gears of war. But to the generation before him, he was nothing more than the senile old veteran. They treated him like a relic, wheeled out to add a touch of color from the past. A few young technicians even chuckled behind his back. Maybe he thinks if he just taps the fuselage, it'll fire right up. The laughter burst out, spread quickly, and then faded, but it was enough to make the air even heavier. Jack did not answer. He only took a small step closer to the helicopter, his eyes never leaving it. His calm unsettled a few of them. None of them knew that in his mind, every rivet of that fuselage carried a memory. He remembered the stench of burning oil, the sound of Huey rotors slicing the jungle skies of Vietnam, the grip of calloused fingers on a wrench as the world collapsed around him. To Jack, the Black Hawk wasn't just a broken machine. It was a bridge to a lifetime he had already lived. Ethan was different. He looked at Jack with half contempt, half pity. He was certain the man had nothing left to give. "We've got certified electronic engineers here," Ethan said, as if to remind everyone who was truly in control. To him, Jack's presence was nothing but another layer of irritation. Sanders gave a small nod, his approval cold and precise. But what they didn't know was that Jack's silence was the most dangerous thing of all. Because that silence wasn't empty, it was the pause of a man who had once heard, with absolute clarity, the whispers of rotor blades as they died. And when he placed his wrinkled hand on that scorching skin of metal, no one could be certain anymore if the Black Hawk was truly dead. In that moment, a single question hung in the blazing air. Could the past rise again in the present, or was it all just an echo in the memory of an old man? And now, dear viewers, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly connect with what I'm sharing. Leave a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see people joining us from all around the world. On the runway hot enough to burn, everyone else busied themselves arguing with the computer, but Jack chose silence. He moved slowly, circling the Black Hawk as if walking beside a creature in hibernation. His calloused fingers brushed lightly along the scratched paint, pausing at a small control panel, tucked discreetly beneath the exhaust, something the young technicians never even bothered to notice. To them, it was just another unnecessary detail among thousands. To Jack, it was like an old scar on the body of a longtime friend. He closed his eyes. The stifling Texas air vanished, replaced by the musty scent of jungle, the swirl of wind and gun smoke, the shriek of Huey rotors ripping through Southeast Asian skies. In 1969, the Aishao Valley was no place for men. Artillery rained down like a monsoon, trees toppled, the very earth shook like a furious beast. Amid the chaos, the Huey under Jack's care had taken a full burst of fire, its engine choking, the aircraft nosediving, shuddering like a wounded bird. The radio crackled out of rhythm, the pilot screamed, the soldiers in back prayed. While everyone else seemed to surrender, Jack, then only 23, crawled out onto the skid, his wiry body clinging to every ridge and groove. The wind howled, threatening to tear him apart. His hands trembled with blood and oil, but his eyes held a strange calm, the kind only war plants into those who have nothing left to lose. From a worn leather pouch, he pulled out a roll of duct tape, a small wrench. Nothing grand, nothing precious, just cheap tools. But somehow, under Jack's hands, they became lifelines. He wrapped, tightened, hammered, adjusted. The clash of metal against metal rang out like a vow shouted into the sky. And then the impossible happened. The engine shuddered, the rotor roared back to life, and the iron bird breathed again. The crew gasped. Some broke down in tears. That reconnaissance team, dragged out of the hell of a Shao that day, would never forget the sight. A young man, under fire, tricking death itself with nothing more than a roll of tape and a stubborn will. The memory flashed and vanished like lightning. Jack opened his eyes, back in Fort Hood. Before him was still the silent Black Hawk, but now it was no longer just a broken machine. It was a mirror reflecting the life he had lived, with scars etched deep into memory. He sighed, his raspy voice spilling out like a message meant more for himself than for anyone else. This bird isn't dead, it's only waiting for a familiar touch. A few nearby technicians heard him, glanced up, eyebrows raised. The words drifted into Ethan Brooks's ears, and, as always, he laughed. A short, dry laugh, laced with contempt. A touch? This is machinery, not a miracle, old man. A couple of others chuckled along, their laughter ringing out as if they'd just watched a comedy skit. One even whispered, "Maybe he's praying it back to life." The air thickened with mockery. Jack didn't bother to answer. He simply withdrew his hand from the steel, his gaze still fixed as though seeing through the fuselage straight into its heart. To the young men, that silence was proof he had nothing left to say. But to anyone who had known war, it was listening. Jack didn't need words. He listened with instinct, with the memory of thousands of flight hours, with a heartbeat once synchronized to the rhythm of rotor blades. The audience might well laugh along with Ethan in this moment, because yes, the sight of an old man stroking an aircraft's skin does seem absurd. Yet in that fragile space between laughter and silence, another question slips in. Could the memory and instinct of a man who once survived hell itself uncover what modern technology has overlooked? The air on the Fort Hood runway was thick enough to cut, as if the Texas sky itself had stopped breathing. The mocking laughter from moments ago still echoed, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Lieutenant Mark Sanders could no longer hold on to his icy composure. Sweat streamed down beneath his helmet, yet his eyes were hard as steel, fixed on the silver-haired man standing there, calm and unmoving as if he hadn't heard a thing. In Sanders's mind, all patience had been spent. He did not see a legendary veteran with some glorious legacy. He saw only a civilian, brazen enough to interrupt a flight operation under his command. His personal authority, his fragile career just beginning, all of it felt challenged by that frail figure, and he would not tolerate it. Sanders's voice cracked out, sharp and dry as a rifle shot. "You are a civilian. You are obstructing a military operation. If you don't leave this instant, I will have the MPs escort you out." The threat snapped through the circle like lightning, fueling the young technician's cruelty. They closed in, their eyes gleaming with a savage thrill at the thought of watching the fossil dragged away. Some muttered under their breath, calling him Ghost Rider, mocking him as a wanderer lost among the phantoms of the past. Suppressed laughter rattled in throats, harsh and jagged against the baking concrete. But amid that ring of contempt, one gaze stood apart, quiet, restless. Young pilot Daniel Ruiz, only 24, stood slightly apart from the others, not joining in the cruel sport. He didn't laugh. He didn't shake his head. He just studied Jack, and in that moment he saw something familiar. Those pale blue eyes, deep, unyielding, reminded him of his own grandfather, a tank soldier who had survived Europe, who once stood for hours in a museum before an old Sherman, staring at it as if listening to a story only two battle-scarred souls could share. A shiver crept up Ruiz's spine. Sanders stepped closer. He lifted a hand, ready to shove Jack from the restricted zone. It was the breaking point, the thin line between youthful arrogance and the last reserve of time's patience. The technicians held their breath, hungry for the spectacle of the fossil being pushed aside to end the scene once and for all. But then the sound came. Not from the helicopter, not from the loudspeakers. It was the shriek of tires on the runway. Heads whipped around. A convoy of black SUVs tore across the tarmac, braking hard just yards away. Doors flew open before the wheels even stopped spinning. From the lead vehicle emerged a figure. Rigid uniform. 3 shining stars on his shoulders. A face carved sharp as granite. Lieutenant General Robert Whitaker, commander of 3 Corps, strode forward with heavy, deliberate steps that struck like hammers on stone. Silence fell at once. Sanders froze, yanking back the hand he had raised toward Jack as if burned. Ethan Brooks, once the loudest braggart, broke into a cold sweat, his face drained of color. The entire team of technicians seemed petrified, eyes wide, mouths locked shut. Whitaker looked at no one else. His gaze, sharp as a blade, cut through the crowd and landed only on the old man standing steady amid the circle. He strode past Sanders, ignored Ethan, ignored them all until he stood face to face with Jack Callahan. And then the unthinkable happened. The 3-star general, commander of an entire corps, the man whose mere presence had silenced the base, lifted his hand to his brow. It was not perfunctory. It was a salute, formal, crisp, heavy with reverence. Sergeant Major Jack Callahan. His voice rang out, steady and resonant enough for every ear to hear. "It is an honor to welcome you back to Fort Hood." The runway went still. Hot wind whipped through the rows of flags as if trying to play a solemn hymn. In that moment, the mocking smirks evaporated. Faces that had sneered were stiff now, eyes darting in panic and shame. Only Jack remained unchanged, pale blue eyes calm, not the least bit triumphant, as if he had known this moment would come. And the question hung heavy in the charged air. If even a 3-star general saluted Jack Callahan, then just who was this man? Dear viewers, Grab a glass of water and get ready for what comes next. The story is only growing more extraordinary. Comment 1 if you're still with us, so we know you're here. The solemn salute from General Robert Whitaker froze the entire runway. In that instant, the jeers of Ghost Rider that had just slipped from the mouths of the young technicians sank like stones into a deep lake, vanishing without echo, leaving only the bitter residue of shame. They had laughed at a living monument they had never recognized. Whitaker lowered his hand and turned fully toward the crowd. His voice thundered, clear and commanding, carrying without a microphone so that every soldier on the base could hear. The man you just mocked once kept 70% of the 1st Cavalry Division's Huey helicopters alive in Vietnam. They didn't call him a crew chief. They called him the Ghost Mechanic because he could bring dead iron birds back into the sky. A wave of murmurs rose, then collapsed into silence. No one dared to speak. Sanders's eyes blinked rapidly, his face drained white as though he had just heard his own sentence passed. Ethan Brooks, the braggart who always sought the spotlight, dropped his gaze to his dust-stained boots, regret etched into every shaky breath. The rest of the technicians stood scattered, hands trembling, looking like schoolboys caught mocking the very teacher who had written the book they studied. Whitaker pressed on, his voice lower now but sharp as a blade cutting into their arrogance. In 1970, Callahan improvised a manual bypass for the fuel system. That modification never appeared in any manual, in any training program. But it saved hundreds of American lives in the very hours when survival was hanging by a single thread. He paused, letting the silence fall heavier than any rebuke. Then he gestured toward the lifeless Black Hawk behind them. This aircraft, the Iron Bird you've been unable to rouse, is the direct descendant of those Hueys. It was born from the legacy Callahan left, from his sweat, his blood, and his will. A few coughs broke out, awkward, then died away. No one wanted to meet Jack's gaze, yet all were compelled to look at him. He stood there, back slightly stooped, pale blue eyes calm. No trace of pride, no smugness, only the weariness of a man far too used to being misunderstood, yet patient enough to let truth speak for itself. The tension was so tight that a dropped wrench would have made them all jump. Some of the youngest technicians shuffled their feet, trying to melt into the background, praying the general's eyes would pass them by. Sanders stood frozen, shoulders rigid, the stern words he had barked moments ago now tightening like a noose around his neck. Ethan sweated so heavily that his shirt clung damp to his back, though he still pretended to study the ground. For a brief moment, the wind whipped through the flagpoles, snapping the stars and stripes with sharp cracks. The sound was like a drumbeat reminder. History is not written only with technology, but with rough, calloused hands by men without names whose marks endure forever. To break the crushing silence, an older sergeant muttered from the distance, "Well, looks like the ghost is real, after all." The words carried to a few ears, flushing cheeks red. A nervous chuckle escaped, but it died instantly when they met Whitaker's ice-cold stare. The hush returned, solemn and chilling. In that moment, Fort Hood felt like an enormous classroom, and today's lesson was clearer than any training exercise. Humility and respect weigh more than 100 glowing screens. Jack Callahan said nothing. He didn't have to. History and now the commanding general himself had spoken for him. But in the minds of everyone gathered, a question began to burn. If this man once saved an entire generation of pilots, could he do the same for the silent Iron Bird before them now? The atmosphere on the runway seemed to congeal. After General Whitaker's words, every gaze turned toward Jack Callahan. No one laughed anymore. No one dared to sneer. Silence itself became a crushing force, pinning the feet of the young technicians as if they were cemented into the burning concrete. Jack said nothing. He needed no defense, no explanation. All he did was open the worn leather satchel, faded by time. The bag was so small that a few of the younger men scoffed inwardly. That little thing is supposed to save a Black Hawk? But when Jack drew out what was inside, the silence deepened. It was a bent wrench, small, polished smooth by decades of sweat and oil. It looked like no standard issue tool, too crude, too antiquated, as though it had just walked out of a museum display. But in Jack's calloused hands, it suddenly carried the aura of a secret weapon, the only key that could unlock the heart of this iron bird. He moved to the Black Hawk's flank, to a small metal panel none of the technicians had ever cared to notice. Every motion was deliberate, steady. Jack slid the wrench over the first bolt. A faint click sounded, delicate as a lock turning in the dead of night. One bolt, then two, then three. Each loosened under his hand with such ease it defied belief that this was rusted steel untouched for years. To outsiders, it was only the mundane act of removing bolts. But for Jack, it was a ritual. Each twist of the wrench not only unsealed metal but opened a memory. The jungles of a Shao Valley, the howl of Huey rotors through sheets of gunfire, the screams, the prayers. All of it surged back, past and present flowing together in his hands. When the panel came free, inside lay a small lever, simple, almost hidden among the tangle of wires. No computer had ever flagged it. No manual had ever mentioned it. This was the emergency bypass only Jack had ever known, his own improvised creation from 1970. He bent close, fingers trembling as they brushed the lever. A gentle push. Click. The sound rang sharp. Final. The lever snapped into bypass. Jack replaced the panel, tightened the bolts with practiced ease, and stepped back. He offered no explanation, just spoke quietly. Enough for Ethan Brooks to hear. Now try it. Ethan froze. His hands, more familiar with keyboards and sensors, shook as they settled on the cockpit switch. He drew a breath, pressed the starter. A taut silence hung like a bowstring. Then the engine coughed, rasping like the first breath of a man waking from a coma. A sputter, a crackle. And suddenly, with a violent roar, the fuselage trembled, the turbines thundered, and the massive blades began to turn. Slowly at first, then faster, faster, until they blurred into a transparent circle. The whump 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 echoing across the entire base. The runway erupted in cheers. Faces that had sneered now shone with disbelief, shouting like children witnessing a miracle. Ruiz, the young pilot, stood motionless, eyes wet. In that instant, he knew he was watching history replay itself before his very eyes. Sanders remained rigid, pale as chalk, fists clenched tight until veins stood out. Ethan, the man who had pressed the switch, could hardly accept that he had just restarted the Iron Bird after 6 hours of failure. Jack did not join the uproar. He simply rested a trembling hand on the helicopter's skin, as though feeling the heartbeat of an old friend returned from the dead. A weary smile, tinged with sorrow, touched his lips. For Jack, this was not victory. It was continuity, a proof that steel still held its soul, waiting only for a hand that knew how to listen. But before anyone could exhale in relief, a sharper question flared in every mind. If Jack could bring a Black Hawk back to life in mere minutes, how many other secrets did he still carry unspoken? The following day, the entire Fort Hood base was abuzz. Few words were spoken aloud, but in every glance, every handshake, every morning greeting, people whispered about the historic moment on the runway. A Black Hawk had been brought back to life by the hands of an old man who, just the day before, had been treated as a joke. And now, overnight, he had become a symbol. General Robert Whitaker did not allow the moment to fade into silence. That very morning, a memorandum was issued from the III Corps Command Headquarters. It circulated through every unit, every maintenance bay, every office. The heading in the first section made many stop and reread. New training program, heritage maintenance. The content was not just about technical skills or standard procedures. It was a fusion of history, battlefield experience, and lessons no manual could ever teach. And in the very first module, the title stood out in bold. The Huey Helicopter, the story of Sergeant Major Jack Callahan. Not a few young technicians frowned as they read it. Some thought it was just a gesture, others gave awkward chuckles to mask the shame lingering from the day before. But one by one, they all understood that what they had witnessed could not be dismissed. That resonant whump-whump that had echoed across the base had become a reminder that technology does not always know everything, and that men who had once walked through hell still had lessons worth teaching this generation. In the days that followed, subtle yet meaningful changes appeared. A few young technicians began reading about the Vietnam War. Some quietly sought conversations with the older veterans on base men they had previously ignored. In the mess hall, where wooden plaques bore the names of fallen soldiers, one could see a change in their eyes, less arrogance, more respect. Not everyone changed at once. Lieutenant Sanders kept his cold demeanor, but it was clear his face had grown more contemplative, his words fewer. Ethan, however, was different. The arrogance once etched into his smile was gone. In the maintenance bay, he worked with greater care on even the smallest details, and sometimes when he thought no one was watching, he would let his hand brush against the skin of an aircraft, mimicking Jack's gesture from that day. 1 week later, on a golden afternoon, 2 young men walked into a small roadside diner in Killeen. The diner was modest, its walls hung with faded photos of cavalrymen riding helicopters, the radio playing a country tune mixed with the scent of fresh coffee. Near the window, Jack Callahan sat alone. Before him, a cup of black coffee, its thin steam curling upward in the sunlight. He did not read a newspaper, nor touch a phone. He simply sat quietly, as if it were the habit of a lifetime. The bell above the door jingled as Sanders and Ethan stepped in. Hats in hand, they froze for a moment, as though wrestling with the last fragments of their old pride. They saw Jack, and without a word, they both knew why they had come. They approached his table and stopped. They did not dare sit down right away. It was Ethan who spoke first, his voice rough, as though swallowing stones. "Mr. Callahan, we came to apologize." Jack looked up, his pale blue eyes kind. There was no reproach, no trace of mockery. He simply nodded and gestured toward the empty seat across from him. "Sit down. Let me tell you boys a few stories about the old bird." The 2 men sat, laying their caps on the table. In an instant, the tension dissolved, replaced by a strange atmosphere as though they were no longer an officer and a technician, but children sitting before a grandfather recounting the war. Jack began to speak, slowly, his gravelly voice echoing like the hum of an old engine. He told of the time he and his crew dismantled an entire gearbox in the middle of a tropical storm, armed with nothing but a flashlight and the conviction that their comrades needed them alive. He told of nights in the jungle, when grease stained under his fingernails, yet the rotor's steady rhythm sounded like a lullaby. He even spoke of the failures, when every effort fell short of keeping a bird in the sky. Ethan sat silent, each story peeling away another layer of arrogance he had worn since joining the army. Sanders clenched his fist, realizing for the first time that war was not only written by glittering metals but also by the silent hands that kept the machines aloft. There were moments when all 3 laughed, like when Jack recalled a young soldier once believing duct tape could patch a shell hole, and strangely enough, it worked. Laughter filled the small diner, mingling with the radio strains of Take Me Home, Country Roads. But after the laughter, silence would return quiet, profound. Outside the window, the Texas sun dipped lower, its light stretching across the dusty road. In that scene, 3 generations sat together. An old man with silver hair, a young lieutenant burning with ambition, and a technician once blinded by arrogance. They were not merely sharing coffee, they were sharing a legacy. And from that moment on, There was no distance between them. Only the simple truth remained, that courage is not found only in the sky, but also in the silent hands that keep America's wings flying. The story does not end here. For when Jack set his coffee cup down, there was a strange glint in his eyes as if there were still more to tell, more secrets yet to be revealed. And the question for all of us is this: if an old mechanic could change the spirit of an entire base in a single day, then what else might he be capable of changing? In the lingering whump-whump of the Black Hawk's rotors, we are not merely witnessing a machine brought back to life. We are witnessing the immortal value of memory, of humility, and of respect for the generations that came before. Jack Callahan reminded us that there are things technology can never measure: the heart, the grit, and the experience paid for in blood and in time. This story is not only about an old mechanic. It is a reminder that, across America, there are still silent heroes walking among us, sometimes weary, sometimes forgotten, but still carrying within them lessons that could save an entire generation. If this story has touched you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and send this video to those who you believe need a reminder about patience, respect, and a legacy that never fades. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so that together we can spread more stories of healing and honor the timeless values of America. And now I ask you, what about you? Do you believe in the familiar touch the way Jack did?
For 2 weeks straight, Sergeant Kendra Cole had become a name synonymous with failure. She veered off target with every shot, stumbled through drills, and when a stun grenade went off, she collapsed as if the past had finally caught up with her. Whispers crept through the El Centro barracks. Maybe she was never meant to be here. One more failure, and it would all be over. But on the very day fate seemed sealed, when everyone thought the final chapter had already been written, a black military SUV appeared. A Navy SEAL officer stepped out. No expression, no explanation. Only 3 words were spoken, words Kendra had not heard again since her last battlefield. The screech of truck brakes tore through the summer heat of Southern California. The heavy military Humvee came to a stop right at the entrance to the Coronado Special Operations Center, and the kind of sunlight that made asphalt wrinkle like the scorched skin of an old man. A cloud of dry dust rose, then quickly settled under the footsteps of a woman wearing the rank of sergeant. Kendra Cole stepped down first. She carried little, just a compact backpack, as if it held only what was truly necessary for survival, and perhaps that was exactly the case. When her left foot hit the ground, there was a brief pause, tiny but noticeable. A regular person wouldn't see it. But anyone who'd been injured before would spot it immediately. That slight hitch wasn't pain, it was the reflex of protecting a limb that had once been shattered. At 33, Kendra was no rookie, but she was also no longer the kind who could be forgiven for adapting too slowly. Her camouflage uniform was crisp, bearing no badges or distinctive marks beyond her name. Hair neatly tied, shoulders straight, her gait said nothing except one thing: she was trying not to leave a trace. The only thing she couldn't hide was her eyes. Deep brown, restless, always in motion. They swept over every window, every sign, every passerby, as if mapping the position of each possible exit without conscious effort. That wasn't habit, that was programming. "Sergeant Cole, Echo 7 class," she said to the administrative officer waiting inside. He handed her a key card without asking a single question. "Second floor, room 208, briefing at 0700, don't be late." In the military, no one cares who you used to be. No one asks where you came from, and they certainly don't want to know why you came back. The only thing measured is performance. Everything else is noise. Coronado Barracks were no different. It had no time for gentleness. The smell inside the housing block was a blend of industrial disinfectant and old wood steeped in the sweat of thousands of trainees over 3 decades. Space was tight, bunk beds pressed close together, leaving no room for individuality. And that was why Kendra's choice of bed drew a few glances. She didn't pick the one near the window, nor the one in the middle of the room. She chose the bottom bunk in the farthest corner, back against the wall, with a clear line of sight to the door. No one asked why, but anyone who's been somewhere that gunfire erupts before you can react understands immediately. Never sleep with your back to the door. Never let someone sleep above you. And always choose a spot you can exit before anyone else can aim. Other trainees began to notice her, not because she was impressive, but because she wasn't in an environment where everyone tries to prove themselves. Her silence became a mirror reflecting back their own doubts and insecurities. And so the whispers began fast and sharp as a paper cut. She's probably some diversity quota. Maybe she used to do paperwork, logistics, or something. A prior move. They need more women, more people of color, more symbols. They muttered as she passed. They called her tourist, as if she were just visiting a world she didn't belong to. She didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't look back. And in their eyes, that was a confession. Only one person among the training cadre stayed silent in a different way: Staff Sergeant Riley, a former Navy SEAL who had seen every kind of survivor return and knew that the most dangerous people were often the quietest ones in the room.
Welcome to Veteran Hero Medal, where silent scars speak, honor lives on, and real heroes wear no capes.
At Coronado, the night is never truly quiet. The ocean wind scraped against the frayed edges of faded tents, rustling through the rows of flagpoles like a familiar whisper no soldier would dare ignore. Everything was regulated: temperature, schedules, rations, except for the faint unease that spread in each trainee's chest before stepping into a new day of training. But that night, one person wasn't asleep. Kendra Cole stood alone at firing range number 3, right at the edge of the security fence. No lights, no supervision, only the moonlight spilling across the weapon, cold metal glinting with a pale sheen, as if the gun were the only thing left reflecting the human part of her. Every motion was deliberate, unhurried, unshowy. Swap magazine, check chamber, engage safety, rotate weapon, switch shoulders, a sequence so flawless that if someone had filmed it, YouTube might have flagged it as real combat footage reenacted. Her hands didn't shake, her breathing was steady. Her eyes were focused but never strained, like a dancer poised just before stepping onto an empty stage. From a distance, Instructor Riley was already watching. He didn't say a word. He simply stood in the dark, shoulder leaning against a post, eyes narrowing as though studying an unfamiliar map. In 20 years of service, Riley had seen all kinds of soldiers, the skilled, the poor, the braggarts, the silent. But there was one type that always kept him on guard, those who seemed to have no need to prove they were good, because usually they really were. Kendra had no idea she was being watched. Or maybe she knew and simply didn't care. What she was focused on wasn't perfection, but recovery. Not proving something, but holding on to something inside her before it broke completely. The next morning in the briefing room, Riley sat quietly, watching as he always did. As always, Kendra chose a seat against the wall, back pressed to cold steel, eyes fixed on the door. She didn't take notes, but her gaze swept over each slide, each name, as if building an operational map without needing GPS. Once, when the lieutenant presenting the mission diagram stood in a shaft of bright light, Kendra subtly tilted her head and lowered herself to avoid the glare, a reflex only someone who had once been shot at through a glass window would understand. At lunch, she sat at the far end of the mess hall, Back to the wall, her food tray arranged with the precision of a formation order. Protein, carbs, vegetables, no conversation, no idle chatter. But her eyes still moved slow, steady, like sonar scanning a room. Others might mistake it for vigilance. Riley knew it was programming, the kind of survival reflex honed over years, not something learned from a PowerPoint in a classroom on combat safety. And then there was the smallest detail that confirmed it. She always used her non-dominant hand to open doors. Her dominant hand was always free, ready to draw a weapon. That was the habit of someone who never believed what lay beyond the door was harmless. She never spoke of her past, never boasted of missions. No one knew what her former unit was, and no one had a good enough reason to ask. Only once, when the class had to submit statements for reason of discharge and medical history, Kendra's form bore the mark M, medical reassignment. No specific injury, no precise date, a classic indicator for those who had served in places where a wrong address is the end of the line. Riley didn't ask, but he began to watch, not to find fault, but to protect something that he realized might be worth far more than he had first thought. Do you think you can guess what happens next? Take a moment, relax, and drop a "one" or "I'm still here" in the comments to keep listening. That afternoon's heat felt like it was trying to peel every layer of skin off the pavement. The air at Coronado had turned dense not because of the weather, but because of something invisible, like a storm waiting to be named. The final evaluation list was about to be announced. Everyone on base knew the elimination roster had already been marked. Those who had made mistakes, failed standards, frozen under pressure, they were about to be crossed out. And at the very top of that list was Kendra Cole. It had been 2 weeks since the day she stepped down from the Humvee, carrying on her shoulders a past no one knew by name. 2 weeks of silently enduring every doubtful glance, every whispered remark slicing through the barracks hallway like a dull blade that still hurt. That afternoon, just as Echo 7 wrapped up a close-quarters battle simulation, another sound cut in an engine, low but heavy, unlike the daily transport trucks. A black military SUV slid through the base gates as if it belonged here more than anyone standing in the yard. There had been no notice, no orders posted, no delegation flag. It stopped near the operations building in a sun-bleached open lot. The rear door opened first. Then the driver's 2 men stepped out, but only one of them froze the air. Commander Jericho Dean. They spoke of him as a legend. In the Shadows SEAL Team 6 years in Yemen, Somalia, operations that were never officially recorded. His eyes didn't seek the command staff. He walked straight ahead, no deviation, as if he had already locked onto a target. And that target was standing at the far end of the training ground, one hand resting on her hip, sunlight in her eyes. Kendra Cole. No one had called her over. No one had warned her. But she turned before Dean even spoke. In that fraction of a second, the air around her seemed to still. She stood upright, arms at her sides, spine like a steel bar tempered in fire. Dean didn't nod, didn't make a request, didn't ask permission. He simply spoke, voice level, not loud, but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Keen blade, activate. 3 words, no more. Yet it was as if a switch had been thrown. Kendra's body jolted, ever so slightly, like a current running through it. In less than a single breath, her shoulders dipped, then squared again, this time no longer the posture of someone trying to appear steady. It was the stance of someone who had once led, once survived, once gone first without needing to be told. The instructors glanced at each other, uncertain. Some trainees stepped back. An instinctive defensive reaction. Markham, the one who had led most of the snide remarks, froze, feeling a chill along his spine, colder than the ocean wind. Kendra moved to the start point of the final drill, the urban response test. Same layout, same scenario they had run dozens of times before, but this time, everything shifted. She was no longer at the back of the formation, no longer waiting for orders, no longer glancing over her shoulder for direction. She took the lead. The training rifle settled into her shoulder as if it had always belonged there. Her movements lost their hesitation, their overcalculation. They became unnervingly natural, like she was replaying a scar in her mind, not following a checklist. At every corner, she was exactly where she needed to be before the threat even appeared. When a target popped from behind the door, her reaction was pure instinct, clean, fast, precise. No trembling hands, no wasted rounds, no need to call out. The rest of the team suddenly found themselves following rather than leading. They didn't understand what was happening, only that if they didn't match her pace, they would be left behind, both in the drill and in real combat. 10 minutes later, the buzzer sounded. Kendra stopped in the center of the yard and removed her helmet. Sweat dotted her face, her breathing light, no smile, no display of pride, only eyes looking straight ahead, steady and distant. Dean stood at the edge, hands behind his back, as if he had never given an order, but everyone knew his 3 words had just awakened someone no one on base had ever dared to imagine. The first thing that changed wasn't speed. It was silence. When those 3 words left Commander Dean's mouth, everything around Kendra Cole seemed to freeze. No signal, no starting horn, no shouted command. But everyone knew the final test had begun, and this time no one dared take the outcome lightly. Kendra stepped to the front line without looking at anyone. No glance, no nod, but the spot she took said it all. She no longer needed anyone's permission. In Echo 7's formation, her role shifted from the one who needs support to the one everyone must keep up with. And the change took exactly 3 strides. The first mock building appeared in the sunlight, its pale gray walls looking like the backdrop of a video game. But to Kendra, this wasn't a game. She crossed the threshold without the slightest hesitation, rifle lifting to the right angle, the right sight line at the right moment. The first simulated enemy emerged from a left-hand hallway, but before the mannequin could finish its mechanical movement, the target dropped. 1 shot, no more, no less. The labored breathing of the trainee behind her didn't distract her. If anything, it was like the faint smoke after a fired round, just background noise, nothing that could pull her off aim. She advanced, each step a tactical choice. None of the old mistakes, wrong angles, wrong speed, wrong rhythm remained. They had vanished as if they'd never existed. In their place was a sequence of actions so fluid it was unsettling, switching shoulders when entering tight corners, reloading tactically while changing direction, clearing rooms in arcs instead of straight lines. No commands needed, no double checking. Markham, the loudest skeptic, found himself suddenly trailing her, caught between astonishment and a scramble to keep pace. Miller, who had once smirked whenever she fumbled, was now working not to fall behind. Torres, all bulk and muscle, had to slow himself so as not to become an obstacle. They were no longer a team, they were an escort detail. At the 3rd station, where most squads stalled due to the cross-hallway layout, Kendra didn't hesitate for a second. She dropped low, gliding through the shadow as if she'd walked this exact path in a dream. She didn't avoid blind corners, she got there first. Even the instructors began murmuring. The stopwatch kept running, but no one dared call a halt. No one wanted to interrupt something operating at this level of precision. Riley stood with arms folded, eyes locked on her, as if he was finally seeing what he had suspected from the very first day. The time limit for the drill was 30 minutes. When Kendra crossed the finish line, the clock read 9 minutes, 47 seconds. No errors, no missed targets, no teammate casualties, and most importantly, no need for backup. Everyone was stunned. There are moments when no one dares speak for fear of breaking what has just happened. This was one of them. Shock rippled outward like a wave, but no one had words to match it. Only Markham, panting, pulling off his helmet, looked at her and asked quietly, as if hoping someone would deny what he had just witnessed, "Who was that?" No one answered. Because they all knew the woman they'd assumed was barely logistics and qualified had just shattered every combat assumption they'd ever had. Kendra didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She didn't glance around for recognition. She simply unloaded the training rounds from her rifle, set it back on the rack like someone who had just finished a job. No one dared approach. She turned to walk away, shoulders straight, hands light, her eyes free of arrogance, but they were absolutely no longer the eyes of someone worried about being cut. They were the eyes of someone who had just been activated. Yet the question still hung in the air. What had kept her contained for the past 2 weeks? And why did a simple phrase have the power to awaken a warrior like that? In the military, there are 2 kinds of silence after a training session. One is when everyone is too exhausted to speak. The other is when someone has just broken what they thought were the rules. That afternoon, after a performance that shattered every notion of standard, no one in Echo 7 looked at Kendra Cole the same way again. Not because they had suddenly become more open-minded, but because they were forced into silence. Because she had just shown them that for the past 2 weeks, what they had mocked wasn't weakness, it was a mask, worn to test them. The internal debrief took place immediately afterward. A small room, folding chairs, a ceiling fan turning slowly. No one sat comfortably. Dean stood at the whiteboard, one hand resting lightly on the USB already plugged in, but he didn't turn anything on. No visuals, no presentation. "You asked who she is," he began, his voice not loud, but as clear as a gunshot in a sealed room. "I'll tell you." Silence. Sergeant Kendra Cole is one of only 3 individuals ever to take part in a special program called Keen Blade, an experimental unit established by Strategic Operations in 2017. The program is unlisted, has no insignia. It selects only individuals whose psychological and physiological profiles exceed intervention thresholds, meaning they have the ability to control emotions and reset tactical responses under pressure at a near inhuman level. Dean paused. A few trainees began glancing at each other. But to protect personnel stability, Keen Blade uses a reflex lock mechanism, a form of unconscious training that only activates when given the exact trigger. In Cole's case, that's 3 words: Keen, Blade, initiate. Torres, the big man always eager for jokes, now stared at his knees. Miller pressed his lips together. Markham fell silent, for the first time unsure how to cover himself. "She didn't fail," Dean continued, his gaze sweeping over each of them. "She was ordered not to show her capabilities, ordered to observe, assess, and wait for the signal. While you were mocking her, she was under orders to evaluate your coordination, your ability to differentiate, and your reaction to unfolding situations." A heavy minute of silence. When Dean left the room, he said nothing more. No directives, No call for discipline. He left only the truth like a stone thrown into a still pond, letting the ripples deal with themselves. That night, the camp felt different. No one went to the coffee stand. No one joked about the rations. Kendra still sat alone in her usual corner, back to the wall. But this time, the space around her wasn't because others were avoiding her, it was because they didn't know how to step in. The next morning, a box of protein bars sat on her table. No name, no note. An unspoken apology. Torres accidentally bumped her shoulder leaving the gym, and for the first time he said quietly, "Sorry," instead of shrugging it off. Even Markham, the team's most arrogant, started lining up behind her at the firing range. No cutting ahead, no snide remarks. But the most telling change wasn't the silence. It was the look. When Kendra walked down the hallway, the looks no longer carried suspicion, not fear, but recognition. No fanfare, no ceremony, just a small shift. But in the military, small shifts are the only kind strong enough to survive. Instructor Riley noticed it all. He said nothing to Kendra, but when she passed the range that afternoon, he gave a slight nod. The kind of nod only those who've lived outside the circle of acknowledgement understand. My dear audience, stay tuned for the next part that will leave you in awe. Take a moment to leave a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see someone joining us from all around the world. Not all survivors want to keep fighting, but there are some who, after walking through battle, choose to stay to teach others how to survive. A week after the final evaluation, the name of Sergeant Kendra Cole was posted on the command board, not under the retraining column, but beneath a new heading. Special Operations Tactical Instructor, Reflex Action Unit. There were no objections, no one asked why, no one even looked surprised. Because they had all seen it, not just an exceptional warrior, but someone who had endured doubt, endured derision, and quietly showed the entire camp she had never needed to be trusted in order to do the right thing. From her very first day as an instructor, Kendra never had to raise her voice. She didn't bark orders. She didn't give unnecessary commands. Yet the trainees began watching the way she moved. Not hurried, not slow, but always perfectly timed. They noticed how she checked blind corners, not with a glance, but as if she could sense exactly where danger lay. They noticed how she reloaded without a single wasted motion. And when she paused in the middle of a mock hallway, lowering her weapon only to watch the formation behind her adjust their pace, everyone understood. This was no longer someone in training. This was someone leading. Markham, the one who had once mocked her without mercy, began focusing more on his close-quarter maneuvers. Torres, the big man who loved a joke, started seriously taking notes on every instruction. Miller, the one who had always kept the greatest distance from her, was now the first to approach, asking to train one-on-one to learn how to listen to the silence between gunshots the way she did. At the modest farewell gathering for Commander Dean lemonade, protein bars, and a few quick words of thanks, Instructor Riley quietly pulled him aside, his voice hoarse. Why keep her in the shadows so long? She didn't need to prove anything. Dean didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward the range, where Kendra was pointing, showing a rookie how to pass through a narrow doorway without exposing a shoulder. Then he patted Riley on the shoulder and said softly, almost like the wind, "Because warriors like her have fought enough. Now it's time they teach others how to fight." The day Kendra left Coronado, there was no send-off ceremony. No medals, no drums or bugles. She simply walked to the edge of the base as if finishing another routine training day. On her back was the same old rucksack, her uniform tailored neatly, long sleeves crossed behind her back, not to hide a tattoo, but so it would be visible when it needed to be. She stood still at the boundary of the compound, eyes on the El Centro desert. 3 weeks earlier, she had stepped off a vehicle here, with her head lowered, her shoulder flinching slightly from an old wound that hadn't fully healed. Now, that very place became the backdrop for her departure, light, steady steps with nothing left to hide. The sunlight cut diagonally across her shoulder, casting a long shadow over the cracked earth. In that light, the old tattoo on her left arm stood out clearly. Parabellum. She had once hated it. The Latin phrase had once felt like a curse. If you want peace, prepare for war. It had been a mark of nameless missions, of sacrifices that seemed meaningless, of stretches of time forgotten behind the fog of politics. But today, in the late afternoon sun, in a windless Coronado, those words were no longer a warning, they were an affirmation. Because for the first time she understood, preparing for war doesn't always mean going to fight. Sometimes it means learning to stand back up after being misunderstood. It means holding on to faith in yourself, even when no one stands with you. And sometimes it means staying silent until the moment comes, then using that silence to awaken trust in others. Kendra Cole's story does not end at Coronado. It's only just beginning with every trainee who has faced the same doubts she once did, with every glance that has learned to pause before judging, and with every silent warrior, those whose names have yet to be called but who are already ready. Sergeant Kendra Cole's story reminds us that some battles don't take place on the battlefield, but in the eyes of others and sometimes within our own hearts. Not everyone is recognized at the right time, and not every value can be measured by scores or achievements. But patience, quiet strength, and loyalty to what's right will always speak for themselves at the right moment. If you've ever felt misunderstood, if you've ever had to hide your true abilities just to get by, then this story is for you. And maybe, like Kendra, you don't need to win every competition, you just need to stand firm until you're truly seen. Thank you for following today's story. If it struck a chord with you, leave a comment below or share this video with someone who needs a reminder. They have never been invisible. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story.